There we go. Okay, so everyone, welcome. I think most of you know me, but in case you don't, my name is Sally Snyder. My pronouns are she, hers, and I am the coordinator of the Diversity Programming Board here at Rogue Community College. I'd also like to introduce my co-hosts. We have Reverend Ernestine Flemister of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, Reverend Tom Berry of Bethany Presbyterian. Reverend Ryan Scott is not with us today. He's with Newman United Methodist, and Jenny Jackson from Project Youth Plus, and also Rogue Community College faculty. And in a moment, I will introduce our guest, Taylor Stewart. Before that, though, just briefly wanted to go through our mission, which is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. And so our ground rules, they're adapted from the Conversation Cafe, and we really want to create a safe space where we can learn and we can share and grow. So we all need to keep our open minds and listen to all points of view and be curious. Suspend judgment as best you can and be accepting. Respect, seek to understand rather than to persuade or convert. Discovery, question old assumptions and look for new insights. Brevity, go for honesty and depth, but don't go on and on and on and on and on. And sincerity. If you want to share a story, please share from your own experience, something that has personal meaning and not somebody else's story. And so also, we do want to invite you to feel safe in this space, that you can ask questions, even if you don't think they're popular. You are welcome to use the chat function to do that, or at the end of towards the end, we'll be able to talk. You can speak out loud. If you want to be anonymous, you may absolutely do a private message to any of the hosts, and we will respect your privacy for sure, but we can get your questions out. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Taylor Stewart. He is here to guide us through reconciliation of our past and towards a brighter future. Welcome, Taylor.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you this afternoon. I'm excited to be here in the Grants Pass community. For those of you who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet, I create these community truth and reconciliation projects about repairing historical injustice. Most specifically, for 3 years, I worked with the community of Coos Bay, Oregon, to memorialize a man named Alonzo Tucker, Oregon's only documented African-American victim of lynching. February 2020, we held a soil collection ceremony near the spot of the lynching, and June 2021, we unveiled a historical marker in the community to memorialize both Alonzo Tucker and the thousands of other African Americans who were lynched in this country. What I like to tell people is that on the historical marker, there are 2 dates of significance: 1902, when the lynching occurred, and 2021, when the historical marker was unveiled, and that we can't fully understand the story of Alonzo Tucker only focusing on the 1902 date, as his story continues on into 2020 and 2021, when that same community where his lynching occurred used his memory as inspiration for becoming a community more committed to the ideals of truth, justice, and reconciliation. And so this spirit, this work of truth and reconciliation, is what I'm hoping to bring to Grants Pass regarding Grants Pass's history as a sundown town, with the goal of, similarly to Alonzo Tucker, rewriting the ending to the story of a sundown town and creating an ending where a formerly exclusionary community can become one of the communities most intentionally committed to inclusivity because of its history. And so one of the things we're working on is an educational resource about what sundown towns look like, both nationally and locally, how that exclusion evolved into the present, and then the next steps a community can take to becoming a more inclusive environment. And so one of the things with which you'll be able to contribute to is, hopefully, we're working on an oral history project to sort of preserve the firsthand memories of sundown towns from both the white perspective of those who remember their community as a sundown town, as well as those of African Americans who remember there being sundown towns in Oregon. And so we do this work to try to capture, while we still can, the memory of the injustice, the effect, but also the resiliency associated with sundown town history in Oregon, as well as those who sort of push back against that over the course of our state's history. And so The title of this work actually is a byproduct of our first Courageous Conversations meeting. The title of this Sundown town work is called The Sunrise Project, with the idea that sunrise is the opposite to sundown and signals the start of a new day. And so as we try and create this intentional cultural climate, we're trying to develop this idea of a sunrise community. And so what I love to tell people is that I wish it was my idea to use the word sunrise, but that idea came from a 69-year-old white male truck driver from Grants Pass. And so that's what came from our first meeting together. And that's sort of what this work is all about, bringing together ordinary people to do extraordinary things. And so I'm so grateful to bring you all into this conversation today, and looking forward to seeing how we can continue to grow this work together. And so the first question that we grappled with back in, I believe it was November, was what would the opposite of a sundown town look like? And so we did that visioning, and that's how that idea of a sunrise community came. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how our conversation today can sort of build off the next question, which is how can we work with our neighbors across the political divide to build a more welcoming community. And so embedded within that is this idea of how can we create a middle space between ourselves and our neighbors, who may be along different political lines, and how can we form partnerships within this common space to sort of no one wing of the community can bring the community along as a whole. We really have to do this all collectively together. And so that includes making partnerships with potentially unlikely sources. And so, I look at my time in Coos Bay, and that's a lot of what we did, as we formed these cross-community partnerships where there became support for the work, even amongst unlikely sources. One of the stories I like to tell is, so I primarily worked with the Coos History Museum, and one of the Coos History Museum board members went on a radio show of someone in the Coos Bay area. This individual is what some would consider far right. They were at the January 6th in Washington, D.C. And so we were a little bit nervous about how this conversation was going to be, as it was going to be about the Coos History Museum's unveiling of the Alonzo Tucker historical marker. But because this individual, the Coos Bay board member, was an older white man who had long-standing ties to the community and had sort of always been a part of trying to uplift his community, he was a safe conversation partner for this radio show host. And through their conversations, while he was at first a little bit hesitant towards, well, what does this discomfort mean for us collectively as a community? But through their conversation, even this sort of unlikely source, someone who at times was antagonistic to the racial justice movement, was able to sort of see the value that this sort of truth and reconciliation work could have to uplifting his community, with the ideas that while we can't change the past, we can always change our relationship to the past, and the idea that we can add these new chapters to history. And so this type of racial justice, historical reconciliation work can really transcend sort of political divide. And this doesn't have to be a liberal or a conservative effort. This can sort of be a community effort that we can hopefully raise the community as a whole. And so part of that is by forming that new partnership across political affiliation, that individual was able to speak to his community better than, say, I or the Coos History Museum board member, because he was able to speak to his audience, who was then able to realize that, oh, I too see this as a valuable contribution to the community. And so that's how, it's a difficult thing to, when I first started, no one was like, yes, kid from Portland, we would love to put up a historical marker about the worst thing that ever happened here. But be able to sort of form these partnerships where we're able to see, I'm an optimist. I believe that no matter where you go, you can find enough people who are willing to choose justice if given the opportunity. It's just a matter of getting them to see where there's been injustice. And so this optimistic belief that everyone has the capacity to be about this work allowed me to form partnerships with those in the community. In Coos Bay, some of the biggest antagonistic forces at the start were some of the biggest supporters by the end of this. And so, truth and reconciliation work is difficult, but it can sort of inspire folks with whom you may not expect. At the Coos Bay History Museum historical marker unveiling, I transitioned this lynching reconciliation work into this conversation about how we need to address the heir to lynching's legacy, the death penalty. And I was a little bit unsure how that conversation was going to go over. I didn't tell anyone I was going to do it, but I made that transition, and to my enthusiastic surprise, it was met with such a warm welcome of like, yes, this is the next step that we collectively want to take. And so if you had told me 3.5 years ago that 300 folks in Coos Bay, Oregon would be cheering about ending the death penalty, I probably wouldn't have believed you. But there's something powerful about this work where in this idea of reconciliation, I like to say that there are 3 R words: remembrance, repair, and redemption. And then in order to get to that final R, we have to do the first 2, and that the transformation happens between repair and redemption. And so the Coos History Museum is now, so we did the historical marker unveiling on Juneteenth. And Coos Bay's 2022 Juneteenth is now a 3-day celebration. And it's been extremely encouraging to see how this cultural holiday has grown in this small coastal community in Oregon. And so because of this, it sort of, it bears the fruits of this actual community change, this actual larger community commitment to justice that they're now able to embody because of this reconciliation work. And so that's sort of the idea that we're trying to bring to Grants Pass. And so part of that is how can we orient ourselves to be messengers for this work, and understanding that people and communities are complex. I had an experience somewhat recently that really put this in perspective for me. I grew up in a conservative white evangelical environment, and I was very much a product of that environment. I graduated high school a registered Republican with the dream of becoming a tough on crime prosecutor. And a large part of that was due to the sort of environment I grew up in. And I went to a small conservative Christian school, K through 12. I had a graduating class of 21. And I returned to that church for a basketball league that some of my friends were a part of, and I joined. And so I was going to this game. I hadn't played basketball in years. And in this experience, I got sick. I was out of shape. I ate too much, and I'm not as young as I used to be. And so it was, what very much could be an embarrassing situation for most part. I was reminded that by the sort of the comfort and the way that the people in that space received me was very supportive. And I didn't feel that sort of embarrassment to the situation that could have been. And it reminded me that people and communities are complex, because I had been feeling a little bit of reluctance to wanting to go back into that space. But I was reminded that there are good people in these spaces, and that in doing this work, we're not getting people to see new values, but the values that they already have in a new way. And so it was a reminder for me on a personal level that we can't put people into these sort of good, bad, conservative, liberal dichotomies, because then we lose the ability to see people as a whole. We had a conversation a few weeks ago that was really impactful to me about how can we have this common language to build these sort of, to develop further these common values. And one of the things was this idea that acknowledging the pain of another doesn't diminish your own. And so that when 2 people are sharing, no one is being heard, and that someone has to have the courage to allow the other to share so that both people can be, they have the courage to listen so that both people can be heard. And so trying to create this environment where we are able to communicate across barriers, and we demonstrate it across political affiliation so that we can still have those conversations across race, across gender, across sexual orientation, across other elements of sort of our social structure. And so we're excited about trying to create this level level of intentionality within Grants Pass to sort of get to that idea of a sunrise community. And I recognize that a lot of this is easier said than done, but that is sort of what trying to become a sunrise community is. It is easier said than done, but by just creating and sort of stating our values and what we want to do, who we want to be, we can get closer to sort of get to those ideals, because that's sort of the direction we're sort of setting ourselves on. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is that it is easier to reach people when we don't see them as different. We have more success when we try to reach people who we see as similar to us. And so how can we create that vision of who we're talking to focus on those common values, those places where we both want to see our community flourish, and to get past the dichotomies that separate us into similar and different, but how can we orient ourselves so that we can make these meaningful connections to collectively create this idea of a sunrise community. And so we are going to do some discussion about how can we do this. And I'm excited to learn from you all. The Courageous Conversations is the brain fund that created the Sunrise Project. And so I'm excited to sort of continue doing this work with you all. And so some of the questions that we'll be talking about today are, how can we orient ourselves to be better messengers? How can we, so that's the first question. The second question being, how can we better see the values of those who are different from us? The third question, what can we learn from our previous experience doing cross-barrier encounters? And then fourth, how can we extend this sort of, intentionality into other spaces? Is there someone new or different in your community, be it your church, your workplace, your neighborhood, that you can reach out to and make sure that they feel welcome and included, so that we can sort of drive this sort of interpersonal element of what a sunrise community looks like. And so Sally will split us off into breakout rooms and we'll start this discussion, come back and see what sort of learning we can all do together. And I thank you very much for being a part of this conversation. I look forward to seeing where it takes us all.
Yeah, and gosh, I've just been so enthralled listening to you. I totally forgot to even push the breakout button room. So it's going to take me a moment to do that. But before I do, I got dressed today. Check this out.
Yeah.
It's like not a total plan. I was like, I want to wear that sweater. I'm like, hey, it goes with our theme. So at this point, before we go into breakout rooms, if you are feeling like you don't really want to say anything, that's fine. Please still join and listen. If you aren't able to join us at all, please do go ahead and drop out for a little bit, because then when I randomly assign it, we won't have a room of 1 or 2. But when you're in the breakout room, please introduce yourself, just say your name, and then choose a spokesperson. So when we come back together, we can share out some ideas that we have. I did post the questions in. All right, so now for time to come back and share. I hope you all picked a spokesperson. And if you could type your name into the chat, if you are the spokesperson, and we can go around and call on people to share what you all discussed. And Jenny, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. Thanks for listing yourself first.
Okay, can you hear me? Am I unmuted and everything's working proper?
Everything's working proper. Go for it.
Excellent. Thank you. I just had the greatest conversation with an amazing group of folks. I had Taylor, our guest speaker, was in the group that I worked with, and Dorothy Swain, and her partner Gary, and I want to say Marie. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting your last name. And Jeannie Lee was a listener who had other things to do, but couldn't contribute. And we had this great, diverse background. I'm born and raised in Grants Pass, born in 75, dating myself there, but I've seen a lot in my time. Our speaker, Taylor, currently lives in Portland and talked a little bit about the Portland perspective. Gary was from Roseburg. He grew up there, and both Gary, Dorothy, and Marie moved here to Josephine County in the Rogue Valley in the 90s. And so talking about our history, and I think we opened our conversation with talking about sundown towns and my personal shame in my teens when I learned about that, and how I know people that saw the signs that were at the bridge, and that kind of personal impact and what that means. We talked so much that I'm surprised that we filled the time so quickly without even referring to the questions, but we talked about the topic with a lot of passion and a lot of action about how we can make a difference and how we can use our voice or even our silence to make a statement and to address the fact that within Grants Pass, within our community, within Josephine County, the majority of our population has good hearts, and that oftentimes the ignorant ones are the ones with open mouths. I think I referred to a quote that says, "Why do people with closed minds always have open mouths?" And that although they may be the most vocal sometimes, that they're really not the majority of what our community stands for. We have good people in our community, and knowing when and how to effectively use our voices and share our stories, and to do things like we do here, to share our courageous conversations and to talk openly and to invite people like Taylor into our community to be visible, to be public, to use our voices as loudly as we can to really impact change, and to let people know that we care about diversity and we care about talking about our past and talking about our future. I've been out for knee surgery, which is why I look awful, but also why I haven't been present at our planning meetings. And when I heard about sunrise towns, it made me emotional because I'm really proud of that concept. So I'm going to stop talking now because there's enough other people to start talking, and I hope I represented my group well.
Thank you, Jenny. And you don't have to be the spokesperson to speak. You're all welcome to join in. Conchetta, I think you were next, please. And oops, we're going to ask you to unmute. There we go.
Okay. I thought Maya had her hand up, but did you have your hand up, Maya? No? Okay. All right. We were a very diverse group, and we were very task oriented. We went through each question and I took notes. So is that okay? Do you want just one question answered at a time, or you want all the questions answered?
Just go ahead. There
was a great dialogue going on. I mean, it was a very, it was good interaction and dialogue, but I'll start. Number one, better messenger. And we really focused on the fact that if you wanted to be a better messenger, oriented as a better messenger, you had to be a better listener. And some folks felt that when you were addressing an issue that you had to feel competent about it and educate yourself about it, while we recognize that sometimes it's just good to say when you're in the middle of something, I really don't know, or this is what I know and I have a lot more to learn. And taking that kind of position can I think open the conversation with someone else who differs from you. And also we felt in that first question that it was really important to understand what you think, but also how you feel in those interactions, to be very aware of your feelings at times, because in those feelings can cause you to shut down and fail to listen. The second question was how to, I don't have the questions up, but do you have them back up? Sorry. Something about values, Sally.
Oh, I gotta, let's see. How can you better see the values of those who are different from you?
Again, that listening was a big thing in our conversation, and accepting where folks are at and taking them where they're at. Don't come with expectations, but really work at seeing their humanity. And again, there's kind of that awareness of your feelings and why have I stopped listening to this person? what's going on inside of me. And when we do that, where there's, the barriers come up. So, and my group can jump in anytime because I'm very, number 3 was what can you learn from previous cross barriers. And when you've crossed them, what have you learned from that? And generally the feeling was, don't give up, and a sense of meeting them with optimism, kindness, and recognizing that there might be an endless amount of resets in your engagement with folks. I myself felt that for me personally, to come at those situations, the word that triggers in me that keeps me more grounded is compassion, compassion, compassion. But at what point are you so compassionate that you're being abused in the interaction? So recognizing that as well, be caring, be compassionate, but also, there's a limit to that interaction. And so it's so important in those situations to remember about your own self-care as well. And I would, the last one was, how would you welcome someone new or different to your community? And Maya shared that it was wonderful when people reached out and invited her to things. And I think we all agreed that if you see someone new, invite them out for lunch, invite them to your church, invite them to a pickleball competition, whatever it is that you might be interested in. So again, group, anything you want to add? I know you're short on time, so I'm not.
Thank you. Next, I'll introduce Gabby Johnson, excuse me. And I'm going to put her.
Oh, you just muted yourself, Sally.
How did I do that? Gabby is a champion for this cause, and she has done a lot of history, work on history. So her email and her phone number is there. And then I'm also going to put a link to a brief history of racism against African Americans in the state of Oregon and the town of Grants Pass. And so this is research that she's put together, so we can all learn more about our past. Go ahead, Gabby.
And as a side note, if you're interested in joining the monthly coalition that meets to talk about these same things and work towards our sunrise town, email me and I can get you any info or answer any questions if you have more questions. I wanted to just highlight 2 stories that came up in our group. One of us shared how they have found that in the progressive community, they've been surprised to see that they identify more personally with progressiveness, but that it's not as tolerant often as they thought it would be unless you can connect back into a dominant narrative. And for this person, they talked about how they've actually found that a surprising community and acceptance among and comfort among people that would identify as fundamentalist Christians or Republicans. And they talked about how even when you get past the gruff exterior, that so many of them are not haters. And they also, it was just an unexpected story that I'm sitting with and holding and wanting to share. And they also had shared that there have been many moments where they identify as homosexual, and so that sometimes people have come up off the street and told stories about, oh, my my friend or my aunt, and sometimes these can be awkward stories, but they can see the desire to reach out and connect and how touching and moving that is. And that was also, there was a grace in that. I think the thing that I'm taking away in some parts is in having conversations with people that are different, seeing what the intention is, even if the delivery or the words are off or whatever it be, seeing that there's someone seeking to connect. And that was just a neat story that was shared that I felt like tied in. And then another of us shared about they're in a context of their family very much identifies as Trump supporters, evangelical Christians, but they identify more progressive and atheist, and in the last many years, there's been a real intention around how to have these conversations. And some things that they've pulled out as being really valuable is really focusing on that common ground and keeping the dialogue open, and remembering that the average people that we see on the other side are not the overall institution, and they're different from they don't all look the same, and there are similarities that they were able to really identify with in the context of all the different ways in which how we approach things or how we get at things. There was a real similarity in that we all care about people, we all want the best for people, and we all want people to live their best lives. And they also shared a story about how remembering growing up in that context, remembering not talking, being afraid to talk to people of color because they were afraid they'd do something wrong, afraid to smile or engage because there's just this, I'm gonna mess it up. And I think there's a lot of people that can identify with that. Sometimes people not connecting is more out of fear. And so giving each other one of the things I took from that is giving each other the benefit of the doubt, in that what we see on the surface might not look like what we think is going on. And I was just so thankful to get to hear and hold those stories. So
absolutely. Thank you. And we're going to be going over time, it looks like. Real quick, I want to go ahead and announce next month's Courageous Conversation. And then Pat and Elliot, you're all welcome to stay with us as long as you can. So let's just see, I'll show you next month. Is it showing our next month's March? Did I get the right screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. So March 29th, noon to 1, we will be talking about reproductive rights. And then go ahead, Pat, thank you.
Okay. We would be interested in Gabriel's studies on the history of Blacks here. We were talking about the sign that was in Grants Pass for quite a while that's apparently missing right now, hidden someplace, about Blacks not being welcome in our town. And we want to be sure that we know the facts, which we are working on. One of the things that was brought out was that young people now hopefully aren't as concerned about race and gender. Their minds are on other things, and hopefully that's a good thing. They don't necessarily see that as the first thing that pops up. So hopefully they're more accepting and more, it's just not as much a major thing as, I've got to be better than somebody because his skin is a different color. And we really were talking about spreading more information, and that maybe we could get in touch with Scott Stoddard and have an article. Black History Month is almost over, but have an article in the paper about the history of Grants Pass in this regard. And Teresa, do you have something to add?
Yeah, I think you covered it. I mean, we talked, it was a rambling conversation. It was a good conversation. I think we talked a lot about, how do you be welcoming without being over welcoming and kind of overwhelming people who are different in whatever way. And that's a challenge. And I'm kind of curious as to how the young people do it, that they are just seeing people as human beings and accepting folks of all races and genders into their circle. And I think maybe some of us older folks are wanting to learn that skill or relearn it somehow. So, but yeah, it was a good conversation. And I think we agreed that awareness and education is the first step. And we just want to know more.
Right, thank you. Where did Elliot go? Let's see, go ahead and unmute, thank you.
Hi, I might share a couple things that folks in our group, Georgia and Ernestine and Anne and Sophie brought up, and feel free to jump in. But also I'd say, Teresa, I think I'm a younger person. I'm like, I don't know that I have it figured out. I'm learning a lot from the teenagers I hang out with, and I also learn a lot from the people who are older than me. So, but it's a nice question, you know, and I love the kind of like intergenerational lens and learning always, you know. Anyway, a couple of things that I wrote down from our conversation. Ernestine was brought up kind of, I guess, in relation to one of the earlier questions, but just about how common it is that people like otherize her or people of color, like that immediately there's this like, how do your people set up your houses? How do your people, you know, this real like making this difference where she was saying like there's a perception that people of color are more different, and really saying like we're not different in all of these fundamental ways. And we also talked about, I think maybe Anne or Georgia was bringing up asking questions, being curious. So yeah, Anne, you were talking about like really in entering a conversation, like being curious about trying to find out something you don't already know, like how did you come to have those values? Why, you know, like, and Ernestine made a point that also really landed for me about that maybe one of the best ways to like see the values of those who are different is to like live with people and be in relationship, not just like try to go out seeking somebody who's different or something, you know, but see that, and you're also still in relationship even as you're learning. And I've been doing some work with my extended family, which felt like connected to that for me. That's been a really like fruitful place to have some of those conversations. And there was also a point about with regard to how to welcoming someone who's new or different, like asking them, what do you need or how can I help you? And not instead of like assuming that you know, but yeah, just asking. Sophie, Ernestine, Georgia, Anne, do you want to add anything in there?
All right, sounds like we had some really good conversation. Taylor, I would like to bring it back to you for any closing thoughts.
Yeah, you know, some of the biggest takeaways that I've had in my listening to folks has been, you know, someone talked about inheriting this history. And I think about what we can hope to pass on to those who come after us, that we can pass on this idea. So we inherited Sundown town history. How can we pass on a sunrise community? And just that idea. And, you know, hopefully if we get to this historical marker, it's something that you can bring your kids or your grandkids to one day and be like, I was a part of that. It helped change this community culture. In terms of how to orient ourselves as a better messenger, two of the things that I've taken away the most from my conversations this last hour were the importance of it is hard to reach someone when you don't first see them. And so sometimes, you know, I'm a sort of a debater by heart, this argumentative sort of logic of, okay, how can I convince you to see what I'm hoping you to see? But that sometimes maybe that is my secondary concern, and that my first approach to this encounter is, okay, how can I see your humanity first, so that the ability to reach you will both come more naturally and be more effective, both because of I've gotten to know you as well as the relationship we've created. And so much of, in order to get to that relationship that we're creating is, as someone mentioned, that the huge importance of listening. And so I've learned a lot about this seeing people in their humanity, as well as the importance of, you're like, all right, I'm thinking, how can I convince you? And so I'm thinking, what combinations of words can I come up with to reach you? Where sometimes it's like, okay, wait, I actually have to listen to you first before I can get to any of that space. And so I've taken away those two things as some primary learning. And I'm really excited to continue this conversation with Courageous Conversations. Hopefully we can do these reoccurring meetings. And, you know, at first it was like Sundown Town Meeting, Sundown Town Meeting number 2. But I'm excited we can have Sunrise Meeting number 1, Sunrise Meeting number 2, and that's sort of where we're at. And I'm excited for the direction we're headed.
Fantastic. And I don't know if we talked about this in our planning sessions. I think we did, but we want to make t-shirts too, things that we can start wearing around with our Sunrise community. So thank you all for joining us today, for bringing your great energy, and keep spreading love and kindness. And nos vemos. Take care.